Okay, we all here? Thank you, everyone. David Wiggins again is my name, from Uppsala, Sweden, and I'm here for this term researching the role of illustration in the Gothic novel, which the period here is about 1765 up to the early 1800s. Probably most of you know what a Gothic novel is, but I very briefly go into it in case you don't, if you don't have a strong literary background. The basic plot line here is you have a young, innocent girl, young woman, who comes from a mysterious background. She somehow gets separated from her family. Invariably, an old, lecherous male sets his eyes on her, starts to pursue her, sequesters her away in some remote, crumbling castle somewhere, and the rest of the story is kind of a mystery of what's going on. Who is this guy? Who is this girl? Strange things are going on in the castle at night. There are apparitions, strange lights, weird sounds, and so in many ways, even though the literary people don't like to talk about it that way, these are kind of very early mystery novels. I think it was a big draw for these novels, and they were kind of a lot of travel intrigue involved in them because there were these long journeys throughout Europe often in the book. This is the Gothic novel is it's flourishing right now in English studies and all, especially over the past 20 years. Nobody really did much with it until the 2000s. It's really exploded now. Here in England, you can get a graduate degree in Gothic studies. There are whole departments that are devoted to it. There are lots of books out now, dozens of them, and more on the way, like this big compendia and encyclopedia formats for the Gothic novel. Very strangely though, nobody's really looked at illustration. And I think that's probably obvious because most people are interested in text. But so I'm coming into this project having sort of an open field in front of me. I don't really know where to go, but I'm trying to look at the role of illustration in these novels. So we pulled up some things from Rare Books here today. Most of them you can't really handle except for the one on the far end here, and I'll explain that in a moment. The first one here is an example of what is widely considered the first Gothic novel. This was by Horace Walpole, first published in 1765. But this is a very special edition from 1796, I believe, with a very special colored printed illustrations. This was very rare during the day. It was very expensive, and if I recall right, these prints were done in Italy. This is the only Gothic novel in hardback form that I'm aware of that has colored illustrations in it. All of them were black and white. So this was a very fine, very expensive book that aficionados, book collectors, and sort of elite subscribers would have bought. It came out simply because when Walpole wrote this first book, The Castle of Otranto, which is again considered the first Gothic novel, it kind of died out and it didn't really, nothing happened with it until about the 1790s. Then the Gothic novel exploded, and this was really a phenomenon here in England. There were theater productions all over England and all over the continent. There were plays, operas, ballets, musical scores, children's toys. It was a real cultural phenomenon when it came out, very popular. The next little book here, and you can pass through and check these more closely when I'm done, I put out because this is a chapbook. So these had been around. These are kind of, in their day, the paperback of the day, cheap street literature, condensed. There were 36 or 72 pages usually. And they were meant to be passed around and kind of abridgments or original stories written in this short format. Normally kind of cheaply done, but this particular one here has a really beautiful engraving in it, which if you go up and have a close look at it, you'll see what I mean. And this engraving also, aside from being very technically well done, really captures the whole mood of the Gothic novel. You have this evil monk with a stiletto at midnight, and there's a moon out the Gothic casement in the background, and this beautiful innocent girl sleeping. And it's really funny because they're really giving away the critical point in the story here, which you don't know it as a viewer when you open this up. You only know it when you've read the text and think, aha. So it's really a very special illustration here. The next one, also a chapbook, is taken from Matthew Lewis's The Monk, which is a very salacious, very controversial book that came out in 1796 or so. This is a chapbook, and the reason I put this out, it has a fold-out illustration in the front, And you can see, when you look at this, it's in panel format. It's very unusual. It's almost like a proto-comic book. And this is much more typical of a chapbook illustration, where the engravings were not so finely done, and you'll see when you look at it closely that the color, which is very common in these chapbooks, was applied kind of crudely. These weren't really refined illustrations in these, but they're kind of fun, and they're very different in the usual way. The last book on your side here is the sort of third format. So we have hardcover, expensive Gothic novels. We have cheap street literature Gothic novels. And then you had other forms like these. This is a ladies' magazine, a compilation of, I think it is the ladies' magazine here at the end. But they actually put a lot of work into serializing some of these Gothic novels and producing some very nice illustrations as well. I said that this was a phenomenon in England. It spread everywhere. It was already endemic in other countries in Europe, especially France and Germany, but it flooded, the European novels flooded those markets in translation as well. The book here, which you are free to flip through, is a book from the 1970s showing illustrations from French Gothic novels. You'll see when you look through there, they have a very different tone than English, because being French, there's a lot more nudity, there's more supernatural content, there's more violence. And that really was a true reflection of what these books were about. That was all there simmering under the surface of the text. But it wasn't really proper here in England to bring those things up, and the French were not shy about it at all. So it's kind of interesting to see what they did. Then we're leaving the long 18th century. The Gothic novel kind of died out in about 1830, but it kind of simmered under the surface, and you had Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre and Dracula came along, and so were these Gothic themes in some of these books. This is a special one, which I brought up especially for you guys, because this book, The Dark Blue, is a very remarkable literary magazine put out by Oxford undergrads in the early 1870s. And it's mostly by a very strange individual named John Christian Freund, who was the editor. And it's very remarkable if you don't know about this book. He somehow lured all sorts of luminaries of the time. Dante Rossetti did some of the art in here. Very famous poets and writers contributed to this. A very interesting book. And one of the people who published it was Sheridan Le Fanu, an Irish author of quasi-Gothic stories. And he published a little story in here which you may not know about. It wasn't so popular in its day, but it's hugely popular now, called Carmilla. And there are a lot of film adaptations of the story. It's a novella really about a woman, a young female vampire. And it had some very interesting illustrations, the nicest of which I've sort of opened up for you here. And this fellow who did this has a very interesting history. You should really look him up. He fled England because the journal went under, he owed too much money, and he moved to New York and had a wild career there as well. So really interesting. Okay, the final book here, you can probably see from a distance already, looks like an outlier, and you're probably wondering, what on earth is this doing out here? Well, the Gothic novel lay dormant until 1960, essentially. And in 1960, there was a little book published by a British author called Mistress of Mellon. And that book apparently was the kickoff to a resurgence of the Gothic novel, primarily in North America, also here in England. But once again, it had the same sort of effect of they couldn't get enough text, they couldn't publish enough books, it became wildly popular. And for those of you who are as old as I am, you might remember, I grew up in the US. These books were everywhere. If you went to the grocery store, they were there at the checkout line, they were in the drugstore, they were in bus stations, they were in airports. And this kind of cover with a young woman on the front, a weird dark house in the background with only one light on. There had to be just one light, and sometimes alert, but dead trees, kind of a dark night sky. There were thousands of these published. So once again, the Gothic novel kind of came back into vogue again. TV shows were made. I don't know if any of you remember Dark Shadows, very popular kind of a soap opera, Gothic soap opera. Movies were made, and once again, it sort of children's games. We had a game called Dark Shadows when we were children, which had vampires and spooky castles in it and this kind of thing. So it resurrected itself, but very strangely, almost all the books have this cover. And some of the publishers actually said that we tried, and you can find some different ones, we tried to do something different, and do some different covers in this, but they don't work, they don't sell. So there's something very powerful psychologically about this, what's called the girl fleeing old dark house motif here that sold books. So it's very interesting to see from an illustration point of view how it went from being quite a varied scene to monotypic, really, when it blew up again in the 1960s and 70s. So the last thing I'll say, if anybody's interested in hearing more about this, I have a flyer down at the end of the room, but I'll be giving a longer lecture about this on November the 1st at Mansfield College for the 18th Century Literature and Culture Research Group, where I'll spend about 45 minutes going into a bit more detail, a bit more quantitative detail about what I'm doing with these illustrations. So feel free to look through and